The morning Heather died, I was standing in the hospital parking lot in my work boots, still smelling like sawdust and machine oil, trying to figure out how to call my parents. It was a Tuesday in late October. The kind of morning where the sky over Kelowna is that flat, gray color that makes everything look like it's been photocopied. I'd gotten a call at the job site around 6 a.m. A brain aneurysm, they said. She'd collapsed in the kitchen while making lunches for the girls. By the time the ambulance got there, it was already too late. Heather was 34 years old. Our daughters Maisie and Brooke were 6 and 4. They were at daycare when it happened. They didn't know yet. I was the one who had to go pick them up and tell them that Mom wasn't coming home. I stood in that parking lot for a long time before I dialed my parents' number. My father, Walter, picked up on the second ring. I told him what happened. There was a pause, and then he said, "God, that's terrible." His voice sounded the way it does when he hears something sad on the news. Concerned, but not shaken. Not the way you sound when your son's wife just died, and your 2 granddaughters just lost their mother. I told him I didn't know what I was going to do. I had a job site to manage, 2 little girls who needed someone with them, and a house full of Heather's things that I wasn't ready to face alone. I asked if they could come, or if we could come to them. We were a 4-hour drive from Vernon, where my parents had retired to. It wasn't the moon. My mother Phyllis got on the line. I could hear her in the background before Walter handed the phone over. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. She said they'd just booked a 2-week trip to Palm Springs. They were leaving Thursday. "The timing is just so hard right now," she said. "You know how non-refundable these packages are." I didn't say anything for a moment. I was looking at the entrance to the hospital, at the automatic doors opening and closing for people walking in and out with their ordinary Tuesday problems. "Phyllis," I said, and I only ever called her by her first name when I was past a certain point. "My wife just died. I know, sweetheart, we know. And we're heartbroken for you. But you're a capable man. You'll figure it out. You always do." That was it. That was what she said. I hung up and sat on the hood of my truck for 20 minutes. Not crying, just sitting there trying to understand how that conversation had just happened. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. My parents were not poor. They were not sick. They were not estranged from us in any significant way. We'd had Christmas together 8 months earlier. Heather had cooked the whole meal. The girls had sat on my father Walter's lap while he read to them. They had a 3-bedroom house in Vernon and 2 spare rooms with beds in them. They were in their mid-60s and in reasonable health. There was no obstacle to them coming except that they didn't want to. What hurt wasn't just the no. It was the way the no came wrapped in language that made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. Heather's parents lived outside of Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Her father, Hugh Brennan, 63, was a retired high school principal. Her mother, June Brennan, 61, had spent 30 years as a labor and delivery nurse before retiring early to help manage the small property they'd built their life on. About 40 acres, mostly woodlot, with a vegetable garden that June took extremely seriously, and a workshop where Hugh spent most of his afternoons building furniture he gave away to anyone who needed it. I had met them only a handful of times in person before Heather and I moved to BC. We'd done video calls every few weeks, and they'd visited twice since the girls were born. They were good people. Quiet, practical, the kind of people who showed up with food instead of flowers. I called Hugh that afternoon, after I'd picked up Maisie and Brooke from daycare and gotten them fed and into a neighbor's care for a few hours. I called him from my truck in the drive because I couldn't have that conversation inside the house where Heather's coat was still hanging by the door. Hugh answered, and I told him. There was silence on the line, not the kind that means someone is composing a careful response. The kind that means a person has just been knocked completely off their feet. Then I heard him say, away from the phone, "June," just her name, nothing else. And I heard her ask what was wrong, and then there was the sound of movement and a chair scraping, and June picked up the extension and said, "Caleb, Caleb, we're here." Her voice broke on my name. I told them everything. The aneurysm, the hospital, the girls, the fact that my parents weren't coming. That last part I hadn't planned to say. It just came out. Hugh didn't ask me any questions. He said, "We'll be on the first flight we can get. You don't have to figure anything out tonight." "You don't have to." Caleb," he said, and his voice was firm but not unkind. "She was our daughter. Those are our granddaughters. We're coming." They arrived 2 days later. I picked them up from the Kelowna airport in the rain. June walked out through the arrival's doors, saw me, and just put her arms around me and held on. She smelled like the same soap she'd always used, something plain and familiar. I hadn't realized how badly I needed someone to hold on until she did it. Hugh shook my hand and then pulled me in. He was a tall man with a firm grip, and he kept his hand on my shoulder the whole walk to the truck. We'd planned on them staying a week. They stayed 4 months. Those first weeks were a kind of fog I still have trouble describing. You go through the motions because the girls need you to. You make breakfast, and you pack snacks, and you sit on the bathroom floor at midnight when Brooke wakes up crying because she can't remember if she said goodbye to mommy that morning. You function, but you're not really there. June made herself indispensable in a way that never felt like an imposition. She learned the girls' routines inside a week, who needed which cereal, who needed a nightlight, which songs Heather used to sing at bedtime. She didn't try to replace anything, she just filled in. She was steady in a way I needed someone to be steady. Hugh fixed things. My truck had been making a noise I'd been ignoring for months. The fence along the backyard had a section down. There was a leak under the kitchen sink. He didn't ask permission. He just did them, quietly, and I'd come home from a site to find something fixed that I hadn't had the bandwidth to deal with. He never made it feel like charity. We buried Heather's ashes in a memorial garden at a place she'd loved on the west side of the lake. Her friends came, people from her work, neighbors. Hugh and June stood beside me and the girls throughout the whole service, and Hugh kept his hand on Maisie's shoulder the entire time. Maisie is the serious one. She holds things in. She leaned into him a little, which was something she didn't do easily. My parents sent flowers, a nice arrangement, lilies, with a card signed "Thinking of you, Walter and Phyllis." They did not come. I didn't call them out on it. I didn't have the energy for that conversation, and honestly, I think some part of me had already started to grieve them. Alongside Heather quietly, the way you grieve a thing you've been pretending wasn't already gone. When June and Hugh finally flew back to Nova Scotia, I stood in the driveway watching their cab pull away and felt the loss of it physically. Maisie cried. Brooke asked when Nana June was coming back. I told her soon, and I meant it. We kept in close touch. Video calls every Sunday, the girls showing June whatever they'd drawn or built or made that week. Hugh started mailing things. Little wooden figures he made in his workshop, horses and bears, and once a very earnest attempt at a moose that Brooke named Gerald and still has on her dresser. It became a running joke between us that he'd never gotten the antlers right. I was making decent money at the time. I managed a mid-sized residential construction crew in the Okanagan and had been doing it for 8 years. But Heather had handled most of our finances, and it took me a while to get a clear picture of where we actually stood. Once I did, I realized we were okay but not comfortable. The house was mortgaged, daycare for 2 kids was brutal, and I was doing most of my own cooking and cleaning and administrative work on top of a physically demanding job. I was tired in a way that didn't lift on weekends. About a year after Heather died, Hugh called me on a Sunday night after the girls were in bed. He asked how I was doing, the real version of the question. I told him the truth. I was managing. But I was also watching myself get ground down a little more every month, and I wasn't sure what the other end of it looked like. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "June and I have been talking. We have 40 acres and a house with more rooms than we use and no mortgage. If you want to come out here, we want you to. The girls could grow up with space. We're not getting younger, and we'd rather spend whatever time we have with them than wander from across the country." I didn't say yes right away. I sat with it for 3 weeks. I talked to my crew. I talked to my boss, who was sorry to lose me but said he understood. I looked into construction work in Nova Scotia and found that while the market was quieter than BC, it was there. I said yes in March. We moved in June. Life in Antigonish County was different from anything I'd known before. I'd grown up in suburban Calgary and spent most of my adult life in the Okanagan, so the East Coast was like a different country in a lot of ways. Smaller, slower, more rooted. People there knew their neighbors' names and their grandparents' names and their grandparents' grandparents' names. If you fixed something for someone, they remembered it and they returned the favor, usually without being asked. Hugh introduced me around. He knew everyone. Former students who were now tradespeople, contractors, guys who ran small businesses and needed someone reliable. Within 6 months, I had more work than I could take on alone. Within a year, I'd brought on 2 guys to help. It wasn't a big operation, but it was mine, and it grew steadily the way things do when you're doing good work in a place where word travels. The girls settled. Maisie made a best friend by the end of her first week of school. A girl named Petra, whose mother had grown up down the road from June, and who had the same serious, watchful quality Maisie did. They were inseparable within a month. Brooke, who had always been the social one, took to small-town life like she'd been born for it. and was apparently on a first-name basis with the woman who ran the post office within 3 weeks of arriving. I watched my daughters learn to help June in the garden. I watched them follow Hugh around the workshop, asking questions he answered with total patience. Maisie started asking him to teach her woodworking. He bought her her own set of child-sized tools, and they spent Saturday afternoons building things together. Brooke preferred to be outside, and Hugh built her a little raised bed garden of her own, where she grew tomatoes and carrots with the zealous attention of someone who takes their responsibilities seriously. I hadn't expected to feel at home so quickly, but something about the pace of it, and the fact that the girls had people around them, and the fact that I was building something real with my hands and my name on it, it settled something in me that had been restless since Heather died. My parents called occasionally. Not often. They sent birthday cards with $20 bills in them, which the girls accepted politely, and which I said nothing about. Walter and I talked sometimes about hockey or family news. Phyllis asked about the weather and whether we were eating properly. Nobody mentioned the week after Heather died, or Palm Springs, or the 2 spare bedrooms. That conversation existed in a space we'd all agreed without saying so, never to enter. In my 6th year in Nova Scotia, I got a call about a property. A man named Fletcher Doyle, 71, had inherited a substantial piece of land about 20 minutes from Antigonish, 180 acres of mixed farmland and forest, with a main house, several outbuildings, and a barn. His family had held it for 3 generations, but Fletcher had no children and no interest in farming, and he decided he wanted it sold to someone who would actually use it rather than subdivide it. He'd asked around about who to talk to. Several people gave him my name. Fletcher and I met for coffee. He told me about the property. I told him about what I did and what I valued. He asked me why I'd come to Nova Scotia from BC, and I told him honestly, the short version of what had happened. That I'd lost my wife and come east because my in-laws had opened their door when no one else had. He listened to all of it without saying much. At the end, he said, "Sounds like you understand what it means to take care of a piece of land and the people on it." We agreed in principle that day. The formal sale took several months, negotiation, financing, and a lot of paperwork. I won't pretend the numbers were simple. I put in everything I'd built over those 6 years, plus a bank loan, plus a private arrangement with Fletcher that allowed me to pay part of the purchase price over time, in exchange for maintaining the main property with him as a tenant for his lifetime, which he preferred to a nursing home, and which I was glad to offer. I spent 2 years working that land harder than I'd worked anything in my life. I kept the construction business running, but scaled back to projects I could manage with one trusted subcontractor. The farmland I leased to a neighboring family who ran cattle and paid me fairly. The timber on the forested portion turned out to be more valuable than anyone had estimated. Not old growth, but a well-managed stand of second-growth hardwood that a sustainable forestry operation was willing to pay well for selective harvest rights. I also converted the main barn into a small event venue, which June thought was a ridiculous idea and which turned out to be very popular for weddings from May to October. Hugh and I talked almost every day during those 2 years. He'd come out on weekends with tools and an opinion about whatever I was building. June organized the kitchen in the main house during a week she spent out there and left it more functional than I could have managed in a year. They didn't ask for anything in return. That was just who they were. By the time Fletcher passed away peacefully in the winter of my 7th year in Nova Scotia, I had a property that was worth something real. Not a number I'm going to invent for drama, but enough that when I commissioned an appraisal, I sat with the paper for a long time before I called my accountant. My parents reached out more frequently that year. Phyllis had seen on Facebook that I'd bought a large property. June had posted a photo of the girls in the yard the previous summer, and she started calling more often, asking questions. How big was the land? Were we thinking about expanding the construction business? Was there a plan for the future of the property? Walter emailed me a link to an article about rural land values in Atlantic Canada. He said it looked like I was doing well for myself. I replied and said yes, things were going well. They asked if they could visit. I said yes. I want to be honest here, because I think this matters too. I didn't have a plan going in. I'm not someone who plots things out or holds onto a vision of a moment the way people do in stories. What I had was a clear sense of what I wanted to do with the property and who I wanted to do it for. And that had been true long before my parents started calling more often. I just happened to have invited Hugh and June to be there at the same time. They arrived on a Friday evening in September. Walter and Phyllis flew into Halifax and rented a car, which was very much in character. They liked having control of their own schedule. They pulled up to the property at around 6:30, when the light was that particular slanted gold you get in the Maritimes at that time of year. I was on the porch with Maisie and Brooke. The girls were polite with my parents in the careful, watchful way children are with people they don't know well, but are supposed to love. Maisie, who was 15 by then, shook hands with Walter. Brooke, 13, said hello and immediately found an excuse to go inside, which I chose not to take personally on their behalf. Hugh and June were inside. June was in the kitchen. Hugh was in the living room reading. We had dinner together. It was a decent meal. June had insisted on cooking, which meant it was significantly better than anything I would have produced. Walter and Phyllis were on good behavior, complimenting the property, asking questions about the acreage and the venue business and the timber arrangements. They were smart people. They knew how things worked. I could see Walter doing the math. After dinner, Maisie and Brooke excused themselves. Fletcher's old tabby cat, who had been part of the property acquisition in a way I hadn't entirely anticipated, followed them upstairs. The five of us sat at the table with coffee. Hugh had been quiet through most of dinner, in his way. He spoke when he had something to say and not otherwise, which was one of the things I respected most about him. Phyllis had directed most of her conversation at me and hadn't paid him much attention, which told me something. I set down my coffee cup. I told my parents I'd brought them out here for a reason, and I wanted to be straightforward about what that was. I told them that 6 months earlier I'd had a lawyer draw up a formal property agreement. Not a will, but a living arrangement that transferred ownership of the 40-acre Antigonish County property, Hugh and June's home, from their name into a family trust held jointly by me, Maisie, and Brooke. I told them I'd also arranged, through the proceeds of the timber harvest and 2 strong years of venue bookings, to clear the remaining mortgage on that property entirely. The house they'd been living in, the garden, the workshop where Hugh had taught Maisie to use a hand plane, the raised bed where Brooke had grown her first tomatoes. It was theirs now, free and clear, and would pass to my daughters. I told them that this was not a business arrangement. It was the only way I knew how to say what I felt, which was that Hugh and June Brennan had been more family to me than I could put into words, and that if I could give them security for the rest of their lives, that was what I wanted to do. June put her hand over her mouth. Hugh looked at the table for a moment, then looked at me, and he had the expression of a man who is trying very hard to hold himself together, which was the most undone I had ever seen him. "Caleb," he said. "That's not," I said. "It's done. It was done 6 months ago. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to hear it directly from me." June reached across and took my hand. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. I looked at my parents. Walter was very still. Phyllis was holding her coffee mug in both hands and looking at the table. They had understood exactly what they'd just witnessed. They knew what I was doing and they knew why, and the reason why was not a secret between any of us. Phyllis looked up after a moment. She started to say something about how lovely it all was, and what wonderful news. Her voice had a slightly hollow quality to it, like she was reading from a card. I listened. I didn't help her along. Walter said he was glad things had worked out so well. He said he and Phyllis were proud of what I'd built. He said it as though he'd been part of building it, and I recognized the instinct because I'd probably have done the same thing in his position. None of us like to see clearly, in the presence of others, what we chose not to do. I didn't say any of that. I said thank you, and I meant a small part of it. My parents stayed for 2 nights and flew home Sunday afternoon. It was a cordial visit. I drove them to the airport and we parted the way families do, who have reached a certain mutual understanding. Nothing resolved, nothing exploded, just a quiet acknowledgement that we all knew the shape of what had happened, years ago and again now. Walter shook my hand at the departure's door. Phyllis hugged me and told me to take care of the girls. I said I would. That was all. I drove back through the Antigonish Highlands and came down through Briarley Brook and pulled into the driveway just as the sun was getting low. Hugh was on the porch. He'd put up a new railing that summer, not because the old one was dangerous, but because he'd seen a design he liked and had built it in his workshop and installed it on a Tuesday while I was at a job site. That was Hugh. He handed me a cup of tea when I got out of the truck. We sat there for a while, not talking much. The birch trees along the fence line had started to turn. Down the slope, past the woodlot, the lights were coming on in the barn where someone was setting up for a wedding that weekend. After a bit, Hugh said, "Good trip?" "Yeah," I said. He nodded and looked out at the tree line. Brooke came crashing out the back door with something to tell me about the cat. Maisie followed, more slowly. with the watchful, almost smile she'd inherited from somewhere I couldn't quite place. She sat on the top step and leaned against the railing Hugh had built and looked at me the way teenagers look at you when they think they've figured out what just happened. Maybe she had. She was Heather's daughter, after all. I drank my tea. The birches moved in the evening wind. Somewhere inside, I could hear June starting to clean up from supper, the sound of water running and cabinet doors, and a radio playing something old, the ordinary sound of a household at the end of the day. I had not gotten what I'd expected when Heather died. I had gotten something else instead, something I hadn't known to look for, and something I hadn't deserved any more than anyone deserves the good things that find them. I had gotten a family that chose me after they'd already lost the person who made us family. That's not something you do over. You just take care of it.